Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and you're watching Varietal Literature's YouTube page, where we, it's just a cozy corner on the internet for narrative. And what we do here on Tuesday nights is we read old folklore and fairy tales. And tonight is a lot of little short and weird stories and one longer one about, well, probably, we'll see how time goes, one longer one about messed up butter from bad cows. So we, if you are here for the first time, first of all, welcome. And down in the description below, if you're not watching this live, there will be timestamps where you can jump ahead to whichever story catches your fancy. If you just want to know about the flaming cow, that story is called The Spooky Cow, I believe. Let me double check, make sure I'm getting the language right here. Yes, The Spooky Cow. So you can jump ahead to that one if you wish. It is very short. We're going to look at, we sort of have two modes that we do on this stream, and one is longer tales, one or two, and the other is several little short accounts from true folklore sources. It is folklore in the strictest sense of the term, where essentially we are looking at I guess urban legends as collected in accounts by the folks from the countryside in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, sometimes even as recent as the 20th. And we're going to be dealing with some translations that are new, that are you have, unless you're quite immersed or have watched this channel before, you will not have encountered before. And some of these stories have never been translated to English before, and they've been recently translated by the incomparable Jürgen Hubert, who you can support on his Patreon, called Sunken Castles Evil Poodles, which I will have in a pinned comment down below. If you are here live, though, there is an already active live chat where Genera says hello. Hello, Genera. Thank you for watching. And GS says good evening and hi to Genera. They're talking about the fact that it might be, some of these stories might be related to mad cow disease. Indeed, they might be. Of course, folklore exists to explain things that we could not otherwise explain, and not just to entertain, although it also aims to entertain. I don't have too much to say tonight, other than to say we're going to look at a few selections of things. We're going to start off with cattle, which is what the icon was referencing. But then we're also going to look at snakes, the king of snakes, which is a source of legend elsewhere. And if you're wondering, is there a connection between them? There sort of is in German folklore, which I'll mention when I get there. But truthfully, they're just sort of little packs of a collected folklore that probably wouldn't have stood alone in their own stream. And so we're just going to look at some animals with uncanny traits. And if we have the time, we're going to look at the end at an Irish story about corrupted butter. Of course, the famous Irish butter. And that story, if I do get to it, you'll find, for those who are checking the description below to timestamp jump, if that's the one that interests you, it's called Bewitched Butter. And it would be at the end of the list. Okay. I don't have too much to add other than to say, because I like to give a little bit of a frame when we go into it, other than to say that, like, you know, the life cycle of the countryside when folklore was sort of in its most vibrant, or at least for our collections, the folklore of the countryside was very much in a time where you would have to find grass fields and take your cattle out, and they would eat all the grass, and there was complex and varying rules over history about how grazing rights worked, because, you know, you didn't want somebody just bringing any of their cattle over to your land and stripping it of grass. Yeah, and there was, you know, restrictions on when you could do it and where you could do it, and obviously all of that cost money, so you didn't want to do it for more than your own cattle. And for all those reasons, you're going to notice some stuff that comes up in these tales where people run afoul of those details. As a general reminder, if you are coming into this with a mind towards sort of taxonomy, you're like, ooh, what is it, these strange creatures actually? Some of the stories give us hints, some of them don't. Some of them might seem like a thing, like from other areas of folklore, but I'll remind you that folklore is not consistent. It makes no effort to be, because it is a bunch of disparate communities and counties coming up with tales to explain weird events that occur around them. Sometimes just sounds in the forest, sometimes weird things their animals did. You know, the amount of truth to them is variable. And I will remind you that the fairy folk, the many different names they go by in various folklore, they are what's the word I'm looking for here? They do live in a different way than humanity. They also follow a lot of our patterns, and you'll see some of that come up. So the idea that they, don't also rear cattle of a different sort than ours, is not an assumption you should make. And when we get down to the Snake King stories, I'll say what I can about them, but to be honest, they sort of stand alone. Okay. So our first story tonight is about supernatural cattle. And this story is called The Red Cow of Warlin. And it comes to us from Jürgen Hubert's collection of translated German folklore, which you can support by going to the pinned comment below, where he has a Patreon called Sunken Castles Evil Poodles. And he translates stuff often for the first time to English from sources in German 16th, 17th, 19th, and 20th century, and 18th century. And that is, of course, where we will find Red Cow of Warlin's story. We're going to read a few short ones about weird cows. So once again, this is called The Red Cow of Warlin, and it comes to us translated by Jürgen Hubert. And let's give ourselves just a little bit of wind, a little less audio, and a little less fireplace. The Red Cow of Warlin, translated by Jürgen Hubert of Sunken Castles Evil Poodles. At the southern end of the village of Warlin, between the roads to Neubrandenburg and Prachtstoff, there is a large, sandy hill in which a barrow was discovered. Linked to this hill is the legend of the Red Cow. Now, when the cowherd drove the cows to the grazing ground on the 1st of May, a red cow would arrive from the direction of the hill and join them. Every evening, when the other cows were driven back home, she vanished. But in the fall, she would return with a golden ribbon tied round her neck. This was the cowherd's payment. And as soon as the ribbon was taken off her, she would return to the hill and only come back in the next spring. When once a craftsman journeyman traveled past that hill, he saw that the red cow was lying on the ground as if ill. He notified the cowherd of this, but as the latter arrived, the cow was gone and has not been seen since. Now, if you are new to these tales, to folklore, not fairy tales, you might be wondering, what kind of story was that? And that's what I mean. They are very much collected accounts from regions of strange things that happened to a friend of a friend many generations ago. And in this case, if you're like, well, folklore has morals, what's the moral here? Folklore doesn't necessarily have morals. They're just stories. They probably do portray a perspective, indeed one you could even call political in the broad sense. But nonetheless, they mostly are just strange stories. So these are the types of stories we're reading tonight. If you do prefer a more elaborate narrative, the last story of the night serves a bit more in that favor. It's still essentially folklore, but if you want something a little more structured like a fairy tale, you should check out last week's show. GS says, what was the gift, the ribbon or the cow? The ribbon. Once the ribbon was removed, the cow would leave. So the cow was paying, I guess, to be herded. Whether that was sent by it or the cow was taking care of itself is unclear and up to interpretation. Our next story is called The Cow from the Rock. It holds some similarities to the last one. One of which being it is also translated by Jürgen Hubert and in the collection Sunken Castles Evil Poodles, who you should support by clicking on the pinned comment down below. Many years ago, the cowherd of Farnroda had his cattle graze next to the Wittgenstein Hill. On several mornings, he perceived an extremely beautiful cow which had joined the herd, but he did not know whom it belonged to, nor where it came from. In the same manner, the cow vanished from the herd in the evenings without him noticing where it had run off. Finally, as late autumn approached, he decided to keep a keen watch along with his young assistants, and saw how the cow appeared out of the overgrown alders beneath the rock, and it went back into them in the evening as well. The next evening, the cowherd wanted to uncover the mystery surrounding this cow further, and ran after it when it left the herd. The cow went into a crevice within the mountain and vanished, while the cowherd followed it, entered a brightly lit corridor, and finally reached a door on which he knocked. Then a maiden came out and asked him, "What do you want?" The herding fee for the cow you are sending me for grazing all those days," the cowherd answered without fear. Well, the maiden gave him an old $1 coin and said, "Now, if you hadn't demanded anything, you would have received more." She left the cowherd standing where he was and vanished. He walked out of the hill and never saw the cow on the pasture again, nor did he ever find the crevice again, which was the entrance to the mountain. And a similar legend of such a cow is also told about in the Hausfeld area. GS says, "I will ponder this for far too long." I wouldn't ponder it too much. They're silly stories. Here we see the first of the sort of local politics and bureaucracy of the time. You know, the cowherd fee, right? He's paying money to have his cows either graze on certain land or whatever else. It's costing him labor and time. So being sent a strange cow to take care of on behalf of some stranger obviously is costly to him, and he feels he is owed. Now, is the moral of the story you should never ask for pay for your labor? Maybe. It's hard to say. Can definitely think of a consistent group through history who might enjoy that moral. If it is, I don't agree. Gonna have a drink of water and we'll carry on. Our next tale is the one that is the namesake for this stream, and it is called The Spooky Cow, concerning a cow from Eisenach. And it again is translated by Jürgen Hubert. In the year 1454, a man named Balthasar Miesakop walked over the Moseberg from the direction of Eisenach one night, not suspecting anything out of the ordinary. then he suddenly perceived a fiery cow, which approached him in a straight path. He was overcome with no little fear and uttered an urgent prayer and made the sign of the cross 3 times as an aid and protection against the evil enemy, and then suddenly the cow was gone, and it seemingly transformed into an old, warped birch tree which stood next to the path and which he could not remember having seen before. This allowed him to pass the tree with a lot of trembling and trepidation. When he pushed past it, he fearfully and carefully turned round to look, and whoa! Suddenly an old woman with an oven fork jumped away behind him and ran directly into the shrubbery and then out over the fields. He saw her running for a long time, but there was no trace to be seen of the old birch tree next to the path. A shudder overcame the man every time he thought of this witchery. Definitely more exciting than any cow I've ever seen. GS says, well, certain courtesies are exchanged, I guess. Perhaps, referring to the cattle herding, asking for a price. You know, it's not surprising that you would get tales about cows behaving strangely, as was noted by people in the beginning of the stream. Cows are generally pretty placid creatures, but they do weird things sometimes. And, you know, just like cats are often associated with being evil things in disguise, it's not that hard to understand why such impressions would be made. I mean, if you've ever met a cat, they are sometimes a little uncanny in their cleverness and violent little things. It's not hard to believe that they would be in league with the devil. But if there is one creature in all of literature and folklore that gets way too fine a reputation, whether it is for cleverness or whatever else, and I think this comes from the Bible making them seem clever, it's the snake. Now here's the thing. A snake is usually seen as sort of a metaphor for someone sneaky and underhanded and wicked, but nonetheless clever. You know, the devil in the Bible, depending on how you want to interpret that section, but throughout history. But if you've ever owned a snake, which I do, they are one of the dumbest creatures to ever be on the earth. I think flies might be smarter than them, to be honest. They are shockingly dumb creatures. And that makes sense because, you know, they are reptiles, and reptiles are a pretty early form of life. They have their own cleverness. They can sort of set traps, if you will. It's not that they are completely incompetent, but they'll also, you know, attack their own tail and bang their head on things and then you know, hurt themselves. And they're tremendously dumb. They will, you know, cook themselves alive if you let them. They're up there with sheep. So the idea that snakes are these clever and insidious little things is funny if you've ever spent time with them. I think if you've, however, gone out to cattle grounds where it's a lot of tall grass that they are chewing away at, your cows and your horses, inevitably they're going to stir up snakes. So we're going to switch over to some stories about snakes. Genera says, fun fact, Bible never actually says the serpent was the devil. That is true. That's why I said however you want to interpret that. Obviously a traditional interpretation is it was the devil. But the text itself doesn't demand it. The point being here, snakes are sneaky. But they have a reputation in German folklore that's a bit interesting. And I'm going to look at one of the main ways that they come up. But I am going to say this. According to Jürgen, the translator of these, one of the ways that snakes are often portrayed in German folklore is as drinking milk, usually from cow udders. Now, my theory, my pet theory, this is based on basically nothing, is that if you are out there grazing in tall grass, snakes are going to be out there, and eventually, udders hang low, your cattle might get struck or bit by snakes on their udders, and it's not too far a leap to see them as trying to drink the milk of the udder, especially if you're assigning intelligence to them that they do not earn. Genera says, fully agree, snakes are kind of dumb. I loved my pet snakes, but they're dumb. Yes, they're very cool creatures. This is not a slight against them. They do fine. Their reputation of being clever is unearned. Like the fox is a clever creature in folklore, and that makes sense. The fox is very clever, very able to get into places it wants to get. Snakes, no. Snakes will... It's amazing they're alive. But anyways, yeah, snakes drinking milk from cows is the best segue I've got to a couple of snake legends that don't concern that feature, but you will see some snakes drinking milk in this. Exactly why is up to you folks to interpret however you want to interpret it. But one thing that is true is in German folklore, many regions have a theory about a snake king. And so we're going to look at some stories about snakes crowding around their king. So our first story about the snake kings and legends of German folklore regions is a few in quick succession here in a collection called the Snake Legends from Ahrensberg and Userin. In Ahrensberg, near Wiesenberg, there once lived a day laborer with his wife. They had a child, a small girl, which always looked pale and sickly. She never wanted to eat anything but milk and bread, and as soon as she had received those items, the little one immediately went outside to the threshold of the house. Now one day the parents watched her and were horrified to see that a snake was eating out of their child's bowl. But then the child was not satisfied that the snake only licked up the milk and hit it on the head with her spoon without fear, saying, "Toad, eat the chunks as well." Then the father jumped outside, killed the snake. But since the child slowly wasted away. Now it changes gears here, because these are a collection of a few little tales about snakes in the region. The gold which the Snake King and his wife wear on their heads as crowns is supposed to be the purest on earth. The snake rulers are very worried about the possible loss of their crowns and know how to punish brazen thieves. But on the other hand, they sometimes gift their crowns as rewards. The following legends from Userin, near Neustrelitz, tell of such occurrences. Around noon, snakes tended to lounge in the sun and put down their crowns, and this was also known to a rider, who put down his handkerchief next to the road. And when he had attained the king's crown in this sly manner, he hurried away with his loot. But as soon as the king realized his loss, he gathered all the snakes of his realm around him, and with this he followed the thief, who saw with considerable fright that the bodies of the snakes rose up high from the ground and darted forth in a high arc. But his fast steed soon carried him to his manor. He gently tapped the neck of his horse with the words, "You aided me loyally." But then he was pierced by a snake which had ridden undetected within the horse's tail. Once, some farmers' children herded geese, and as they heard a lot about the Snake King and his fondness for shiny white things, they washed their aprons in the lake and spread them next to each other in the sun so that the Snake King would put his crown on them. But they did not want a poor girl in their midst who only wore a coarsely woven apron, and thus forced her to put the apron down alone apart from the others. However, the Snake King crawled all over those fine aprons and gifted his crown to precisely this girl. I think my favorite thing in folklore is when something is said with the weight of like a very insightful and important message, but what they've said is so deeply confusing when taken as a whole. Like, obviously it's supposed to be something about, the poor or something like this, but it's, it's so strange. Let's carry on with some snake legends. Specifically, the Snake King. Oh yes, there's many stories of the Snake King. Let me get a drink of water here. Our next tale is called The Snake King, and it comes again from Jürgen Hubert's translations of German folklore, Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, which you can support in the Patreon below, and you should. Some good stories this month. In the middle of the forest, close to the city of Zolz, there is a small pub called Muckenkrab, or the Gnat's Keg. People claim that many years ago, a large snake with a golden crown on its head frequently appeared here. This gold was purer than all the other gold on earth and emitted a rather strange shine. The locals called the animal the Snake King because of its crown. The owner of the Muckenkrab at the time had a small son who had a deep friendship with the snake. He ate and drank and played with the snake, and the snake was around him all the time and never did him any harm. Much later, when the boy was grown into a tall adult man, he killed the Snake King, why the legends do not say, and gifted the crown to his parents. His parents then sold the crown and became rich people thanks to this. There's a moral there, but it's not one that you would normally think would be in these sorts of tales. If you feel that your folklore should have morals, let that one stand for you. It's like goes out of its way to explain that it never did him any harm. He kills it for no reason that is worth saying, apparently, and they all get rich for it. The moral of the story is to be a brutal capitalist. I think we will have time for that corrupted butter story, because this is our last Snake King story. Janera says, might get it for my dad. We've started a tradition of exchanging books for Christmas/winter solstice, and I think he'd love this. If you're referring to Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, he is releasing some... He has one volume that's already released that I think you can get as a physical form through Amazon. But the main way that you get them is they are a big EPUB file that you can get through the through supporting the Patreon. So if your father is able to deal with e-readers, it works very well. And I think it's fair play. I mean, it's a monthly fee of a few dollars at most, and you get everything that's been done before, and then the stuff he continues to translate. Our next tale is called The Snake Dance. And it also comes as a translation by Jürgen Hubert in his collection Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles. Two men from Karlitz decided to go fishing at a lake on Sunday. They cast their lines, but no fish wanted to bite. Then the men started to swear terrible, foul curse words on that Sunday morn. And within a moment of it, a whole swarm of snakes came over the water. There was a snake with a golden crown leading them. The fishers, overcome with dread, fled on to a nearby hill. But after the snakes had reached the shore, they followed him there as well, and they started an eerie dance around the crowned snake in the center. Well, the fishers regretted their swearing and shiveringly returned back to Carvitz. I mean, this story sounds strange, but it is one of the easier ones to explain. They're doing, they're skipping church, and then they're swearing while they're doing it. Okay. Good. We have time for the Bewitched butter. Now, this is one of the more odd stories that I've ever encountered. And I'll give you a quick frame as to why. The structure of this story is unusual. It comes to us not from Jürgen Hubert. This comes to us from, we've read from it before, Yeats's collection of Irish folklore called Fairy and Folk Tales of Irish Peasantry, published at the turn of the century. I gotta stop saying that. There's already been a turn of the century in my life. The turn of the century that I consider the turn of the century, not the recent one. But the actual structure of it is very odd. You'll see what I mean. It doesn't take the format really of folklore or fairy tales. It's sort of a tale about my neighbor did this, but it's actual where it chooses to spend its time and how it chooses to spend it is very, very unusual. And I hope in that you guys will find it interesting. Generis has got to watch that cholesterol. Yeah, especially if you're Celtic. Lots of cholesterol problems in the genes for us who are Celtic. Our final story, and our longest of the evening, is called Bewitched Butter, which comes to us from Queen's County in Ireland, as collected by W.B. Yeats in his book Fairy and Folk Tales of Irish Peasantry. About the commencement of the last century, there lived in the vicinity of a once famous village of Agavo a farmer, a wealthy farmer. He was named Brian Costigan. This man kept an extensive dairy and a great many milch cows, and every year made considerable sums by the sale of the milk and butter. The luxuriance of the pasture lands in this neighborhood, has always been proverbial, and consequently Brian's cows were the finest and most productive in the whole country, and his milk and butter the richest and sweetest, and brought the highest price at every market at which he offered these articles for sale, which is saying a lot if you've ever had Irish butter. It stands above. Now things continued to go on thus prosperously, with Brian Costigan, when, one season, all at once, he found his cattle declining in appearance, and his dairy almost entirely profitless. It has a little content warning here. There's nothing too gruesome, but it is a little gruesome, the sickness of his cows. Brian at first attributed this change to the weather, or some such cause, but soon found or fancied reasons to assign it to a far different source. The cows, without any visible disorder, daily declined and were scarcely able to crawl about on their pasture. Many of them, instead of milk, gave nothing but blood. And the scanty quantity of the milk which some of them continued to supply was so bitter that even the pigs would not drink it, whilst the butter which it produced was of such a bad quality and stunk so horribly that the very dogs would not eat it. Well, Brian applied for remedies to all the quacks and fairy women in the country, but in vain. Many of the impostors declared that the mysterious malady in his cattle went beyond their skill, whilst others, although they found no difficulty in tracing it to superhuman agency, declared that they had no control in the matter, as the charm under the influence of which his property was made away with was too powerful to be dissolved by anything less than the special interposition of divine providence. The poor farmer became almost distracted. He saw ruin staring him in the face. Yet what was he to do? Sell his cattle and purchase others? No, that was out of the question, as they looked so miserable and emaciated that no one would even take them as a present, whilst it was also impossible to sell to a butcher, as the flesh of one which he killed for his own family was as black as coal and stunk like any putrid carrion. The unfortunate man was thus completely bewildered. He knew not what to do. He became moody and stupid. His sleep forsook him by night, and all day he wandered about the fields amongst his fairy-stricken cattle like a maniac. Affairs continued in this plight when one very sultry evening, in the latter days of July, Brian Costigan's wife was sitting at her own door, spinning at her wheel, in a very gloomy and agitated state of mind, it should be said, happening to look down the narrow green lane which led from the high road to her cabin. She espied a little old woman, barefoot, enveloped in an old scarlet cloak, approaching slowly with the aid of a crutch which she carried in one hand, and a cane or a walking stick in the other. The farmer's wife felt glad at seeing the odd-looking stranger. She smiled, and yet she knew not why, as she neared the house. A vague and indefinable feeling of pleasure crowded on her imagination, and as the old woman gained the threshold, she bade her welcome with a warmth which plainly told that the lips gave utterance but to the genuine feelings of her heart. "God bless this house and all belonging to it," said the stranger as she entered. "Oh, God save you kindly, and you're welcome here, whoever you are," replied Mrs. Costigan. "I thought so," said the old woman with a significant grin. "I thought so, or I wouldn't trouble you." The farmer's wife ran, placed a chair near the fire for the stranger, but she refused, choosing instead to sit on the ground where Mrs. C. had been spinning. Now Mrs. Costigan had time to survey the old hag's person minutely. She appeared of great age. Her countenance was extremely ugly and repulsive. God, folklore is just so brutal sometimes. Her skin was rough deeply embrowned as if from long exposure to the effects of some tropical climate. Her forehead was low and narrow and indented with 1,000 wrinkles. Her long gray hair fell in matted elf locks from beneath a white linen skull cap. Elf locks are dreadlocks, frankly. Her eyes were bleared, bloodshot, and obliquely set in their sockets. Her voice was croaking, tremulous at times, partially inarticulate. As she squatted on the floor, she looked round the house with an inquisitive gaze. She peered pryingly from corner to corner with an earnestness of look, as if she had the faculty, like the Argonaut of old, to see through the very depths of the earth. Whilst Mrs. C kept watching her motions with mingled feelings of curiosity, awe, and pleasure.
"Mrs.," said the old woman at length, breaking silence, "I am dry with the heat of the day. Can you give me a drink?"
"Alas," replied the farmer's wife, "I have no drink to offer you except water. Else you would have no occasion to ask me for it."
"Oh, well, are you not the owner of the cattle I see yonder?"
said the old hag, with a tone of voice and a manner of gesticulation which plainly indicated her foreknowledge of the fact. Mrs. Costigan replied in the affirmative and briefly related to her every circumstance connected with the affair, whilst the old woman still remained silent, but shook her gray head repeatedly, and still continued gazing around the house with an air of importance and self-sufficiency. When Mrs. C had ended, the old hag remained a while as if in a deep reverie. Then, at length, she said,
"Have you any of the milk in the house?"
"I have," replied the other.
"Show me some of it."
Well, she filled a jug from a vessel and handed it to the old sibyl, who smelled it, tasted it, spat it out, what she had taken on the floor.
"And where is your husband?" she asked.
Out in the fields," was the reply.
"I must see him."
A messenger was dispatched for Brian, who shortly after made his appearance.
"Neighbor," said the stranger, "your wife informs me that your cattle are going against you this season."
"She informs you right," said Brian.
"And why have you not sought a cure?"
"A cure!" re-echoed the man. "Why, woman, I sought cures until I was heartbroken. All in vain. They get worse every day."
"And what will you give me if I cure them for you?"
Anything in our power," replied Brian and his wife, both speaking joyfully and with a breath.
"All I will ask for you is a silver 6pence, and that you will do everything which I will bid you," said she.
Well, the farmer and his wife seemed astonished at the moderation of her demand. They offered her a large sum of money, for he certainly had it.
No, said she. "I don't want your money. I'm no cheat, and I would not even take 6pence, but that I can do nothing till I handle some of your silver."
Well, the 6pence was immediately given her, and the most implicit obedience promised to her injunctions by both Brian and his wife, who already began to regard the old beldam as their tutelary angel. The hag pulled off a black silk ribbon or fillet which encircled her head inside her cap and gave it to Brian, saying,
"Go now, and the first cow you touch with this ribbon, turn her into the yard. But be sure, don't touch the second, nor speak a word till you return. Be also careful not to let the ribbon touch the ground, for if you do, all is over.
I need to start saying that at the end of things. You need to give me a glass of water. But should it spill, all is over. Brian took the talismanic ribbon and soon returned, driving a red cow before him. While the old hag went out and, approaching the cow, commenced pulling hairs out of her tail and at the same time singing some verses in the Irish language in a low, wild, and unconnected strain. The cow appeared restive and uneasy, but the old witch still continued her mysterious chant until she had the 9th hair extracted, but then ordered the cow to be driven back to her pasture and again entered the house.
Go now, said she to the woman. Bring me some milk from every cow in your possession.
She went and soon returned with a large pail filled with a frightful-looking mixture of milk, blood, and corrupt matter. Leave it at that. The old woman got it into the churn and made preparations for churning, though obviously had misgivings about such things.
Now, she said, you both must churn. Make fast the door and windows, and let there be no light from the fire. Do not open your lips until I desire you. And by observing my directions, I make no doubt, but ere the sun goes down, we will find out the infernal villain who is robbing you.
Well, sticking with their deal, Brian secured the doors and windows and commenced churning the awful fluid. The old sorceress sat down by a blazing fire, which had been specially lighted for the occasion, and commenced singing the same wild song which she had sung at the pulling of the cow hairs. And after a little time she cast one of the 9 hairs into the fire, still singing her mysterious strain and watching with intense interest the witching process. And a loud cry, as if from a female in distress, was now heard approaching the house. Well, the old witch discontinued her incantations and listened attentively. The crying voice approached the door.
Open the door quickly,
shouted the charmer, and Brian unbarred the door, and all 3 rushed out into the yard. And when they heard the same cry down the boreen, but could see nothing.
Ah, it is all over, shouted the old witch. Something has gone amiss, and our charm for the present is ineffectual.
They turned back, quite crestfallen, when as they were entering the door, the Sibyl cast her eyes downwards, and perceiving a piece of horseshoe nailed on the threshold, she vociferated,
Here I have it! No wonder our charm was abortive. The person that was crying abroad is the villain who has your cattle bewitched. I brought her to the house, but she was not able to come to the door on account of that horseshoe. Remove it instantly, and we will try our luck again.
Brian removed the horseshoe from the doorway, and by the hag's direction placed it on the floor under the churn, having previously reddened it in the fire. They again resumed their manual operations. Brian and his wife began to churn, and the witch again to sing her strange voices, and casting her cow hairs into the fire until she had them all nearly exhausted. Her countenance now began to exhibit evident traces of vexation and disappointment. She got quite pale, and her teeth gnashed, and her hand trembled, and as she cast the ninth and last hair into the fire, her person exhibited more the appearance of a demon than a human being. Once more, though, a cry was heard, and an aged red-haired woman was seen approaching the house. Quick.
"Oh!" roared the sorceress. "I knew it would be so. My charm has succeeded. My expectations are realized. Here she comes, the villain who has destroyed you."
"What are we to do now?" asked Brian.
"Say nothing to her," said the hag, "but give her whatever she demands, and leave the rest to me."
Well, the woman advanced, screeching vehemently, and Brian went out to meet her. She was a neighbor, and she said that one of her best cows was drowning in a pool of water. That there was no one at home but herself, and she implored Brian to go rescue the cow from destruction. Well, Brian accompanied her without hesitation, having rescued the cow from her perilous situation, was back again in a quarter of an hour. It was now sunset, and Mrs. Costigan was set about preparing supper. During supper, they reverted to the singular transaction of the day. The old witch uttered many a fiendish laugh at the success of her incantations, and inquired who was the woman who they had so curiously discovered. Brian satisfied her in every particular. She was the wife of a neighboring farmer. Her name was Rachel Higgins, and she had been long suspected to be on familiar terms with that spirit of darkness. She had 5 or 6 cows, but it was observed by her sapient neighbors that she sold more butter every year than other farmers' wives who had 20. Brian had, from the commencement of the decline in his cattle, suspected her for being the aggressor, but as he had no proof, he held his peace. "Well," said the old beldam, with a grim smile,
"It is not enough that we have merely discovered the robber. All is in vain if we do not take steps to punish her for the past, as well as prevent her inroads for the future."
"And how will that be done?" said Brian.
"I will tell you as soon as the hour of 12 o'clock arrives tonight. Do you go to the pasture. Take a couple of swift running dogs with you. Conceal yourself in some place convenient to the cattle. But watch them carefully. And if you see anything, whether man or beast, approach the cows, set on the dogs. And if possible, make them draw the blood of the intruder. Then all will be accomplished. If nothing approaches you before sunrise, you may return, and we will try something else."
Convenient, there lived the cowherd of a neighboring squire. He was hardy, courageous young man, always kept a pair of very ferocious bulldogs. To him, Brian applied for assistance, and he cheerfully agreed to accompany him, and moreover proposed to fetch a couple of his master's best greyhounds, as his own dogs, though extremely fierce and bloodthirsty, could not be relied on for swiftness. He promised Brian to be with him before 12 o'clock, and they parted. Brian did not sleep that night. He sat up anxiously, awaiting the midnight hour, and it arrived at last. His friend, the herdsman, true to his promise, came at the time appointed. After some further admonitions from the Colic, they departed. Having arrived at the field, they consulted as to the best position they could choose for concealment. At last they pitched on a small brake of fern situated at the extremity of the field, adjacent to the boundary ditch, which was thickly studded with large old white thorn bushes. That was my favorite sentence I've read tonight. I love it. Here they crouched themselves and made the dogs, 4 in number, lie down beside them, eagerly expecting the appearance of their as yet unknown and mysterious visitor. Here Brian and his comrade continued a considerable time in nervous anxiety. Still, nothing approached. It became manifest that morning was at hand, and they were beginning to grow impatient, and were talking of returning home, when, on a sudden, they heard a rushing sound behind them, as if proceeding from something endeavoring to force a passage through the thick hedge in the rear. They looked in that direction, and judge of their astonishment when they perceived a large hare in the act of springing from the ditch, leaping on the ground near them. They were now convinced that this was the object which they had so impatiently expected, and they were resolved to watch her motions narrowly. After arriving to the ground, she remained motionless for a few moments, looking around her sharply. She then began to skip and jump in a playful manner, now advancing at a smart pace towards the cows, and again retreating precipitately. But still, drawing nearer and nearer at each sally, at length she advanced to the next cow and suckled for a moment. Then on to the next, and so respectively to every cow on the field. The cows all the time roaring loudly and appearing extremely frightened and agitated. Brian, from the moment the hare commenced its suckling, the first was with difficulty restraining from attacking her. But this was more sagacious companion. His more sagacious companion suggested to him that it was better to wait until she would have done, as she would then be much heavier and more unable to effect her escape than at present. Then, so the issue proved. For being now done suckling them, her belly appeared enormously distended. So she made her exit, but slowly and with apparent difficulty. She advanced towards the hedge where she had entered, and as she arrived just at the clump of ferns where her foes were couched, they started up with a fierce yell and hallooed the dogs upon her path. The hare started off at a brisk pace, squirting up the milk she'd sucked from her mouth and nostrils, and the dogs making after her rapidly. Rachel Higgins' cabin appeared through the gray of the morning twilight at a little distance, and it was evident that Puss seemed bent on gaining it. Although she made a considerable circuit through the fields in the rear, Brian and his comrade, however, had their thoughts, and made towards the cabin by the shortest route, and had just arrived as the hare came up, panting, almost exhausted, and the dogs at her very scut. She ran around the house, and evidently confused and disappointed at the presence of the men, but at length made for the door, and in the bottom of the door there was a small semicircular aperture, resembling those cut in fowl house doors for the ingress and egress of the poultry. To gain this hole, Puss now made a last and desperate effort, and had succeeded in forcing her head and shoulders through it, when the foremost of the dogs made a spring and seized her violently by the haunch. She uttered a loud and piercing "Ah!" and struggled desperately to free herself from his grip. and at last succeeded, but not until she left a piece of her rump in his teeth. The men now burst open the door and met a bright turf fire blazed up on the hearth, and the whole floor was streaming with blood. No hair, however, could be found, and the men were more than ever convinced it was old Rachel who had, by the assistance of some demon, assumed the form of the hair, and they now determined to have her if she were over the earth. They entered the bedroom and heard some smothered groaning, as if proceeding from someone in extreme agony. And they went to the corner of the room from whence the moans proceeded, and there, beneath a bundle of freshly cut rushes, they found the form of Rachel Higgins writhing in the most excruciating agony and almost smothered in a pool of blood. The men were astounded. They addressed the wretched old woman, but she either could not or would not answer them. Her wound still bled copiously. Her tortures appeared to increase, and it was evident that she was dying. This aroused the family, who thronged around her with cries and lamentations, but she did not seem to heed them. She got worse and worse. Her piercing yells fell awfully on the ears of bystanders, and at length she expired, her corpse exhibiting a most appalling spectacle even before the spirit had well departed. Brian and his friend returned home. The old hag had been previously aware of the fate of Rachel Higgins, but it was not known by what means she acquired her supernatural knowledge. She was delighted at the issue of her mysterious operations. Brian pressed her much to accept some remuneration for her services, but she utterly rejected such proposals. She did remain a few days at his house, and at length took her leave and departed, no one knew whither. Old Rachel's remains were interred that night in the neighboring churchyard. Her fate soon became generally known, and her family, ashamed to remain in their native village, disposed of their property and quitted the country forever. The story, however, is still fresh in the memory of the surrounding villagers, and often it is said, amid the gray haze of a summer twilight, may the ghost of Rachel Higgins in the form of a hare be seen scudding over her favorite and well-remembered haunts. I don't know where you would land that story. It's almost a ghost story, right? Well, there, we did some stories about cows and the strange ways they get about. Whether it was cows from the fairy folk, cows that seemed to be shape-shifted witches or evil at any rate, or cows that were cursed by such things. And we also took a little detour into the strange world of the Snake King. And I do have some comments from Jurgen, but I think I'll get to them next week because we're at an hour. What I will say, though, is I hope you folks enjoyed the stories. Strange as they are. Like I said, this one was an odd one. It's very unusual for folklore to take such a granular, focused look at the minute-to-minute action of something. And it is interesting. It doesn't really ever explain itself. It breaks a lot of rules. Not rules, but generally you see rules. Like usually the wicked witch woman is tricking you or something like that. Doesn't go against her own kind. But not in this case. And then it's like she won't take any more money. And that's unusual too, because usually that is the thing that the Fae tries to do, where Fae try to offer you more money than you actually earned and entrap you when you take it. But that's not the case here either. It's a very unusual story in its focus, its structure, and even the sheer depth of its description, but I really did enjoy it. Genera says, I imagine it would make a cool movie or comic. Oh, that would be cool. There's so many stories here that would be rich for visuals. And yeah, Genera points out great imagery. And Shayna, hello Shayna. Lovely to see you in the chat again. Shayna Towers says, is agreeing with GS, who says, what a rich selection tonight. Well, I'm glad people enjoyed it. I am still on the search for solstice and Christmas tales. Tragically, I may have exhausted most of my supplies, but to those who have sent me some stuff, which some people have, I am picking through it. If you do not know what the issue is, the problem is that a lot of winter tales are not really winter tales. They're sort of all year round tales. They might have parts that take place in winter, or they're very particularly about the Christian Christmas, which is fine. I've read a lot of those tales, but they do tend to follow the exact same pattern every time, and you can't, spend 6 weeks reading about Santa talking about Jesus or whatever. That wouldn't necessarily fit the spirit of the show, which is supposed to be broad selections of stuff. And the other problem that we encounter is that there are lots of mythology and folklore around the winter solstice and so on, but not so much stories, right? So like there's events, like there's Saturnalia, which is an old Roman pagan thing that occurs in December. That's a very cool event to read about and whatever, but it doesn't really have a story. The 12 Days of Christmas comes from, well, it's debatable where it comes from, but it seems to come from Norse mythology, and it seems to be related to the Wild Hunt, riding for 12 days with Thor at its head, or Odin, depending on who you ask, but most commonly Thor. The Wild Hunt has a lot of associations to Christmas, but we did that last year. There aren't so many. The winter is the time of death and quietude. And I think most of the time, I'm starting to get the impression people would have rather heard tales about hot summers coming. But with that said, if you folks do come across an open source or otherwise Creative Commons, public commons collections of folklore themed around winter, it doesn't need to be Christmas, do let me know in the comments or wherever else so I can take a look and see if any of them sort of fit the vibe of the show. Beyond that, thank you so much everybody who came and huddled around my fire and heard the stories. Peculiar ones this evening, but that's folklore for you. I'll keep the fire warm. You have yourself a good sleep.